In the dense fog of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, 1939, a single-engine plane cut through the gray sky, carrying pilot Harold Thompson on what should have been a routine flight. But then came a sound that froze him in terror, his own voice echoing from somewhere far below, screaming for help. Not a radio transmission, not a passenger, just him crying out from the shadows of the forest. When Harold landed, search parties found nothing. Weeks later, locals whispered of a cursed stretch of sky where aviators vanished, their calls trapped between earth and air, leaving only mystery and fear. Harold Thompson was born in 1906 in Portland, Oregon, into a family that valued precision, discipline, and adventure. From a young age, he was captivated by the mechanics of flight. As a boy, he spent countless hours dismantling and reassembling model airplanes, often frustrating his parents with the piles of gears and wings that littered the attic. By the time he reached his teens, Harold's fascination had turned into a relentless drive. He devoured every book on aviation he could find, from technical manuals on engine maintenance to memoirs of daring early pilots. The skies were not just a playground for him. They were a calling, a place where skill and instinct could converge into a single, exhilarating experience. Harold's formal training began at a small aeronautics school on the outskirts of Portland. There he learned to navigate both the technical and psychological demands of piloting. He mastered the instruments, practiced emergency maneuvers, and logged endless hours of solo flight. Instructors quickly recognized a rare combination of precision and intuition in him. Where others relied solely on instruments or rote technique, Harold had an almost instinctual sense of the air currents, able to anticipate turbulence, wind shear, and the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that could make or break a flight. He was meticulous in his preparations, but he also carried a certain calm under pressure that set him apart from his peers. By the late 1920s, Harold had earned a reputation among Oregon's small but growing aviation community as a pilot of extraordinary reliability. He was frequently contracted for mail routes, an assignment that demanded both endurance and meticulous attention to detail. Flying over the rugged terrain of the Pacific Northwest was no trivial task. The dense forests, steep ridges, and sudden weather changes meant that a single mistake could be fatal. Harold approached each flight with a quiet intensity, methodically reviewing maps, checking instruments, and running pre-flight inspections that some considered obsessive. Yet for him, this attention to detail was not overcaution. It was respect for the air, the machinery, and the lives that depended on him. Beyond his technical skill, Harold was also known for a sense of calm professionalism. Colleagues remembered him as a man of few words, but his silence carried a gravity. When storms rolled in or equipment malfunctioned, he did not panic or overreact. Instead, he relied on years of experience, carefully analyzing the situation, making small adjustments, and trusting both his training and his instincts. Fellow pilots would later remark that there was a certain serenity in the way Harold navigated the skies, an almost meditative quality that seemed to draw him into the rhythm of flight itself. Outside of aviation, Harold was a private man, devoted to his family and quietly engaged in his community. He had a small circle of friends who shared his love for exploration and invention. On weekends, he could often be found tinkering with engines, experimenting with rudimentary radio equipment, or hiking through the forests that would later play such a pivotal role in his most infamous flight. These excursions were not mere hobbies. They were part of his larger pursuit of understanding the natural world and the challenges it presented to human ingenuity. As the 1930s progressed, Harold's career expanded beyond mail delivery into passenger transport and charter flights. He flew business people, researchers, and occasionally government officials through the mountains and along the rugged coastline. Each flight demanded meticulous planning and awareness, particularly when navigating the unpredictable weather patterns of the Pacific Northwest. His reputation as a pilot who could deliver both cargo and passengers safely under difficult conditions grew steadily. He was trusted not only for his skill but for his judgment, his ability to remain composed when confronted with uncertainty, and his uncanny knack for anticipating danger before it became imminent. By the time 1939 arrived, Harold Thompson had become one of Oregon's most respected aviators, known for his precision, calm under pressure, and deep understanding of the skies. His colleagues admired him, His family relied on his steadiness, and the small aviation community regarded him as a man who could be trusted in any circumstance. It was this combination of experience, skill, and intuition that would make the events of that October flight so chilling. The man who had mastered the skies, who could predict the air currents and navigate treacherous ridges with ease, would soon confront something he could neither anticipate nor control, something that would defy every lesson he had learned and haunt the region for decades to come. The flight that would haunt Harold Thompson began like any routine journey, but the sky over Oregon that October morning in 1939 held an unfamiliar tension. The sun struggled to pierce through a thick layer of mist that clung stubbornly to the Cascade Mountains, painting the world in muted grays and silvers. Thompson's Bellanca monoplane hummed steadily beneath him as he ascended from Portland, its engine a comforting constant in the otherwise eerie stillness. He had flown this route countless times, delivering mail and occasional passengers to remote communities. Yet the mountains that day seemed different, ominous, as if they were aware of his passage and intent on testing him. The first sign that something was amiss came not from the instruments, but from the atmosphere itself. The mist thickened unnaturally, swirling around the wings in patterns that defied the wind currents Harold knew so well. It clung to the fuselage, creating a subtle vibration that made him tense. He had flown through fog countless times, but this felt alive, almost anticipatory. He adjusted the throttle, climbed a few hundred feet, and tried to steady his breathing. Everything seemed normal. The instruments showed steady altitude, airspeed, and heading, but the feeling persisted. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, almost lost in the drone of the engine and the whistle of the wind across the wings. Harold assumed it was a distress call from another pilot or perhaps a passenger in a nearby aircraft. But the sound sharpened with alarming clarity, and a dread settled in his chest. It was his own voice echoing across the mountains, pleading for help. The words were unmistakable, each syllable an exact mirror of his own intonation. His heart raced, a cold sweat forming along his spine as he scanned the empty sky. No other plane was visible. No radio transmission came through. There was nothing, except the voice that seemed to rise from the very forest below, a twin of his own, crying out from the depths of the mountains. Harold's training urged him to stay calm, to rely on his instruments and his knowledge of aerodynamics, yet an instinctive terror gnawed at him. He attempted to trace the sound, banking the plane and peering into the foggy chasms of the Cascade Ridges. The mountains were steep, their dense evergreens concealing every possible hiding place. Shadows shifted in the mist, giving the impression of movement where there was none. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. Perhaps it was an echo, a rare acoustic phenomenon, or a trick of the wind, but every explanation fell short. The voice continued, hauntingly precise, repeating the same desperate cry, "Help me, please." As he maneuvered over the ridges, the mist seemed to thicken with each attempt to locate the source. The landscape below became a blur of dark shapes, and the once familiar peaks transformed into a maze of foreboding cliffs and valleys. The air pressure shifted unexpectedly, making the plane lurch in ways Harold had never encountered on this route. He fought to maintain control, eyes darting from instruments to horizon, trying to reconcile the physical world with the impossible sound that seemed to emanate from beneath him. It was as if the mountains themselves were conspiring against him, twisting reality to trap him in a nightmare suspended between sky and earth. By the time he descended to a lower altitude, hoping to land in a clearing and investigate, the voice had ceased, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears. The forest below was dense and impenetrable, a dark sea of trees stretching to the horizon, hiding secrets Harold could not reach. His mind struggled with disbelief and fear, grappling with the impossible fact that he had heard his own voice calling for help from nowhere. Each passing second intensified the feeling that he was being watched, followed by an unseen presence that observed his every move from the shadowed ridges. Landing in a clearing miles from any settlement, Harold felt a grim sense of unease. The engine's hum was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of his isolation. He checked the aircraft meticulously, ensuring no mechanical failure or hidden anomaly could account for the eerie experience. Everything was in perfect working order. Yet the haunting reality remained. He had flown through the mountains, fully alert and in control, only to hear a voice identical to his own, echoing through the fog, calling for help in a place where no one could possibly be. The flight that should have been ordinary had transformed into a journey into a realm where reason faltered, and the familiar sky became a stage for the unexplainable. In the months and years leading up to Harold Thompson's fateful flight, locals in Oregon's Cascade Mountains had whispered of strange sounds and inexplicable sightings that seemed to defy rational explanation. Loggers, hunters, and trappers who spent long hours alone in the dense forest often reported hearing voices carried by the wind, only to find no one in the vicinity. Some claimed to have glimpsed small, shadowy figures darting between trees, vanishing before they could be fully seen. These reports were often dismissed by outsiders as exaggeration or the product of isolation. Yet within the tight-knit communities scattered across the ridges, they were taken seriously. People spoke of the mountains with a reverence mixed with fear, acknowledging that the terrain itself held secrets far beyond human understanding. The Cascade Mountains were notoriously unpredictable. Fog could roll in without warning, cloaking ridges and valleys in impenetrable gray. Sudden storms could trap even experienced travelers, and avalanches or landslides could obliterate paths that had seemed safe moments earlier. In such conditions, it was not uncommon for travelers to feel disoriented or hear faint echoes of sound, but those who lived there long enough learned to differentiate natural occurrences from something stranger. Yet, even the most seasoned residents could not explain the reports of voices that seemed to come from nowhere, calling out names, issuing warnings, or repeating phrases in tones that were eerily human. In 1937, 2 years before Harold's incident, a team of surveyors mapping a remote section of the Cascades reported hearing a voice calling for help while they were deep in a canyon. They rushed to the source, expecting to find a lost hiker or perhaps a downed aircraft, but found nothing. Not a single footprint disturbed the fresh snow. Not a single tree bore evidence of recent passage. The incident was recorded in their field notes as an unexplained auditory phenomenon, a phrase that barely scratched the surface of their unease. Other accounts surfaced over time. Hunters hearing their own names whispered in the undergrowth. Trappers hearing the clatter of tools when none were in use. Even occasional reports of phantom lights bobbing among the peaks at night. Locals often speculated that the forest itself was sentient, capable of mimicking human voices to lure travelers off course or to punish those who ventured too far from safety. This belief was rooted not only in folklore but in repeated experiences that defied simple explanation. Some older residents recounted stories passed down from earlier generations, tales of pilots and travelers who vanished in the mountains under mysterious circumstances. According to these legends, the mountains had long been a place where the boundaries between the living and the unseen blurred, where echoes of the past lingered and sometimes reached out to the present. While modern reasoning dismissed these as mere superstition, those who had lived their entire lives among the Cascades could feel a subtle, unnameable presence when the fog rolled in and the trees whispered in the wind. During the 1930s, aviation over the Cascades was becoming more frequent, yet the mountains remained one of the most dangerous regions for flight. Pilots reported sudden turbulence that seemed to appear without cause, instruments behaving erratically in pockets of dense air, and unaccountable sounds echoing through the valleys below. Harold Thompson, familiar with every nuance of the local weather, knew that these anomalies were unusual. He had heard accounts of other aviators experiencing disorientation or auditory illusions while flying over certain stretches of the forest, but nothing compared to the phenomena locals described on the ground. Voices repeating names, voices mimicking familiar tones, and sounds that seemed to originate from the very rocks and trees themselves. Even before Harold's flight, some of his colleagues had warned him to remain cautious over the Cascade Ridges. They spoke of an area they called Screaming Ridge, where pilots occasionally reported hearing voices or strange calls that caused confusion, panic, or even mid-flight deviations. While these accounts were often told as half-jokes, half-warnings, Harold noted them with a seriousness that few of his peers shared. He respected the land, understood its dangers, and considered the reports not as superstition, but as potential evidence of environmental or atmospheric phenomena that were poorly understood at the time. In retrospect, the combination of local folklore, prior sightings, and strange auditory reports created a foundation of unease over the region that would contextualize Harold Thompson's own terrifying experience. The mountains were more than a backdrop for flight. They were a character in their own right, shrouded in mystery, capable of both fascination and fear. What Harold would encounter during that October flight was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of decades of unexplainable occurrences, a moment where local legend and lived experience intersected with reality in the most chilling way possible. Harold Thompson's encounter with his own voice began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as he maneuvered his Bellanca monoplane through the fog-laden ridges of the Cascade Mountains. At first, it was a faint murmur, barely distinguishable above the hum of the engine and the whistle of the wind across the wings. He assumed it was the echo of his own words or perhaps a radio glitch from a distant station. Pilots often experienced auditory illusions at high altitudes or under stress. It was something Harold had read about in technical journals and heard described by colleagues. But this sound was different. It had an unmistakable familiarity, a precision of tone and inflection that could only belong to one person: himself. The first clear words cut through the mist like a knife. "Help me. Please." Harold froze, his hands tightening on the control yoke. The voice was identical to his own. Not a distant imitation, but a perfect replication, echoing from somewhere below the dense forest canopy. His instincts screamed at him that something was gravely wrong. He scanned the terrain beneath him, the trees stretching endlessly, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching into the fog. No other aircraft, no glimmer of movement, nothing but the silent, oppressive forest and the taunting voice that seemed to come from the very ground. Panic threatened to take hold, but Harold's years of experience kept him steady enough to act. He checked the instruments, the altimeter, the compass, the engine readings, all normal. Mechanically, the plane was sound. There was no reason for this auditory anomaly, no explanation grounded in physics or atmospheric science. Yet the voice persisted, repeating the plea in the same urgent tone, carrying an impossible emotional weight. It was not just words. It was fear, desperation, and a strange familiarity that made it feel as though he were listening to a fragment of his own soul calling from some unseen abyss. As he banked the plane over a valley, the mist thickened, wrapping the wings in a damp embrace that made the aircraft shudder. The voice seemed to move with him, rising and falling as though it had its own awareness, reacting to his attempts to locate it. He realized with a creeping horror that no amount of maneuvering would reveal its source. Every angle he took, every descent or climb only reinforced the illusion, or perhaps the reality, that the sound was emanating from the very mountains themselves. The trees below, dark and unmoving, became a labyrinth he could not penetrate, and yet the voice remained clear and impossible. Harold's mind raced for rational explanations. Could it be another pilot? Impossible. Could it be a reflection? A rare acoustic phenomenon where sound waves were trapped and repeated in the canyons? The perfect mimicry of his own voice argued against it. Could he be hallucinating? Perhaps, but he had flown hundreds of hours without experiencing such a vivid auditory mirage. His training taught him to account for fatigue, hypoxia, and disorientation. Yet nothing in his body or mind indicated a lapse. Every instinct, every ounce of logic and experience confirmed the terrifying truth. He was hearing himself calling for help from somewhere unreachable. The experience grew more disorienting with each passing minute. The voice sometimes seemed to come from directly beneath him, echoing between ridges, and sometimes from just beyond the fog, teasing the edges of his vision. Shadows in the mist appeared to move, though he could never verify what they were. A branch might tremble as though brushed by a hand, or a rock shift slightly in the undergrowth, yet when he looked closer, nothing disturbed the perfect stillness of the forest floor. The mountains had become a trap, a place where perception and reality intertwined, and the voice was both the lure and the terror that anchored him to a nightmare unfolding in real time. Harold's heart pounded with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and disbelief. He attempted to call for help over the radio, but the transmission system remained silent. No response came from any station. The mountains swallowed his voice even as he struggled to locate the one that echoed his own. Each repetition of the plea, "Help me, please," was a hammering reminder that whatever he was experiencing defied every rule he had learned, every protocol he had mastered, and every law of nature he trusted. The longer it persisted, the more Harold understood the terrifying isolation of the moment. It was not merely a flight over treacherous terrain. It was a confrontation with something beyond explanation, something that toyed with the mind and the senses. His own voice crying out for help from the unseen depths of the forest. was a phenomenon that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A vivid and unshakable reminder that in certain corners of the world, human experience can intersect with the inexplicable in ways that leave reason powerless. When Harold Thompson finally landed in a small clearing miles from the nearest settlement, the forest around him seemed to exhale, as if releasing the tension that had built during his terrifying flight. The engine's drone became a low, steady hum, a grounding sound amid the lingering fog and shadows. He cut the throttle and stepped out of the cockpit, eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for any indication of a person, a downed plane, or even an unusual formation that might explain the impossible experience. But the clearing was empty, silent and undisturbed, as though no human, or any living creature capable of speech, had ever been there. Harold immediately contacted the authorities, reporting the voice he had heard, the impossible replication of his own tone, and the desperate plea for help that had echoed through the mountains. Search parties were quickly organized, composed of local law enforcement, forest rangers, and volunteer loggers familiar with the area's rugged terrain. They scoured valleys, creeks, ravines, and abandoned logging camps, combing through every crevice and hollow the dense forest had to offer. Despite their diligence and extensive knowledge of the Cascades, the search turned up nothing. Not a single footprint, not a fallen branch out of place, not a clue to the source of the voice that had terrorized Harold in flight. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. Harold's aircraft was inspected thoroughly, from engine to radio equipment, to ensure there were no mechanical failures or hidden anomalies that could have produced hallucinations or auditory distortions. Every system functioned perfectly, eliminating the possibility of technical error. Investigators questioned Harold extensively, verifying his flight path, timing, and altitude. His account was consistent, precise, and free from the contradictions that often emerge in high-stress situations. Pilots who had flown with him attested to his reliability and clear-headedness, reinforcing the notion that he was not imagining what he had experienced. As the days passed, the mountains themselves seemed to resist explanation. Other aviators who had flown over the same stretch reported nothing unusual, though some admitted that thick fog and sudden air currents sometimes created disorienting echoes. But no one had experienced anything remotely like Harold's encounter. Loggers and hunters spoke in hushed tones of the Screaming Ridge, recounting stories of voices echoing from nowhere, strange shadows flitting between the trees, and unexplained lights that bobbed over the peaks at night. Though dismissed by some as superstition, the consistency of the reports lent them an unsettling credibility. Authorities expanded the search, employing horses and even early motorized vehicles to reach remote areas that were otherwise inaccessible. Yet the forest swallowed every attempt to uncover the source. After weeks of investigation, the parties began to realize that this was not a conventional disappearance or miscommunication. The mountains themselves seemed impervious to scrutiny, a place where the rules of the natural world failed to apply. Harold's voice, repeated back to him from an unseen source, remained an enigma, an anomaly that defied both science and reason. Even the psychological aftermath for Harold was significant. Pilots are trained to expect danger, to respond to mechanical failure, and to anticipate unexpected weather, but nothing in their training prepares one for hearing a human voice that is simultaneously your own, calling out from nowhere. He became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by the memory of the sound and the oppressive fog that had hidden it. Friends noted subtle changes, long periods of staring into the distance, quiet mutterings about echoes and shadows, and a nervous hesitation before taking to the air again. For someone whose life had been defined by precision, control, and trust in the physical world, the experience challenged his understanding of reality. The lack of physical evidence created a dilemma for the investigators and the public alike. How does one explain a voice with no origin? A call for help with no victim in a forest that had been meticulously searched? Newspapers reported the story with a mix of fascination and skepticism, portraying it as an unexplained oddity, a human interest tale tinged with fear. Yet within aviation circles and the local communities of the Cascades, Harold's account became a cautionary tale, a warning that the mountains held more than treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather. They harbored something that could reach beyond reason, ensnaring even the most experienced pilot in a mystery with no end. Weeks turned into months, and the search parties disbanded, leaving behind only trampled brush and unanswered questions. The forest reclaimed its secrets, the mist rolling over ridges and valleys as if nothing had occurred. Harold Thompson resumed flights, but he never again approached the stretch of mountains where the incident had occurred. The memory lingered in every shadow, every whisper of wind, and every stretch of fog that clung to the Cascades, a reminder that the mountains were alive with unexplainable phenomena, and that the search for answers was often as elusive as the mist itself. Over the years, the local communities surrounding the Cascade Mountains began to weave Harold Thompson's experience into a broader tapestry of folklore and legend. Residents spoke cautiously of what they called the Haunted Sky Corridor, a stretch of airspace that seemed to defy explanation and claimed the attention of aviators, loggers, and hikers alike. The name itself evoked a sense of foreboding, a tacit acknowledgement that the natural world in this region held phenomena that could unsettle even the most rational minds. Tales of voices, apparitions, and disorienting sensations in this corridor became part of the oral history, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Some accounts described pilots hearing their own names called out from the mist, accompanied by the sensation of being watched by an unseen presence. Others spoke of fleeting glimpses of figures among the trees or odd lights that danced along ridges at dusk, vanishing before a second look could confirm them. These stories were shared in hushed tones in local taverns, logging camps, and among aviators' circles, often beginning with a warning, "Don't fly that stretch alone." While outsiders might dismiss these accounts as superstition, the consistency of the details across decades suggested something more than mere imagination. The mountains, it seemed, had an enduring capacity to disturb, to confound, and to leave a lingering sense of unease. Folklorists and local historians later documented these reports, noting that the region's dense forests, jagged ridges, and persistent fog created conditions ripe for unusual acoustic and optical phenomena, whispering winds, echoes bouncing between valleys, and visual distortions caused by mist and light could explain some incidents. Yet Harold Thompson's case remained exceptional. He was an experienced pilot, fully alert and meticulously trained, with no mechanical failure or environmental anomaly that could convincingly account for the voice he heard. The eerie precision of the phenomenon, hearing his own voice, calling for help, was a detail that no folklorist or skeptic could dismiss. Within the community, Harold's flight became a touchstone for discussions about the boundary between the natural and the inexplicable. Elders who had heard the story emphasized that the mountains should be approached with respect and caution, not merely for physical dangers like cliffs, avalanches, or storms, but for the unknown forces that might linger there. Children grew up hearing warnings of voices that could mimic a person's own, the fog that concealed more than terrain, and the forest that could play tricks on perception. These tales, though presented as folklore, carried an undercurrent of genuine fear. Those who ventured too far alone or ignored the warnings were often met with small, inexplicable incidents, missing tools, fleeting shadows, or the sensation of being followed. Aviation experts who studied the Cascades occasionally referenced Harold's story as a cautionary example of the psychological and environmental challenges pilots could face in remote, rugged areas. Training manuals from the era rarely addressed such phenomena, focusing instead on mechanical failure, navigation, and meteorology. Harold's account, however, highlighted that human perception could be unreliable under stress, fog, and isolation, and that the natural environment could present dangers that went beyond the measurable. The Haunted Sky Corridor became a shorthand for areas where both human error and unexplainable experiences could intersect, serving as a reminder that experience and skill did not always confer immunity. Some researchers speculated that the phenomenon Harold encountered might have been linked to atmospheric anomalies unique to the Cascades, possibly involving sound waves trapped between ridges, temperature inversions, or rare acoustic reflections. Others, drawing on the oral tradition, suggested something far darker, a lingering imprint of human fear, echoes of past tragedies, or even a sentient quality within the forest itself, responding to intruders with voices that mimicked the living. These theories, scientific or mystical, did little to quell the sense of dread that clung to the corridor. The legend of the Haunted Sky Corridor persisted throughout the 20th century, with pilots and hikers reporting strange occurrences that mirrored the original incident. Harold Thompson's flight was no longer just an isolated event. It became a narrative lens through which all strange occurrences in the region were interpreted. The mountains, fog, and valleys became more than mere geography. They were characters in a story that spanned generations, a place where the boundary between reality and the inexplicable seemed thinner than anywhere else. Those who recounted the tales understood that the corridor was not just haunted in a literal sense, but haunted in the way it challenged perception, disrupted expectation, and left an indelible mark on those who passed through it. The lasting legacy of Harold Thompson's flight over the Cascade Mountains has been as much psychological as it has been historical, leaving an imprint that endures in aviation circles, local communities, and the folklore of Oregon. Even decades after the incident, pilots who studied his experience spoke of it with a mixture of awe and unease, recognizing that it highlighted the limits of human perception and the profound uncertainty that could emerge in even the most meticulously planned flights. Harold himself became a symbol of the inexplicable, an experienced aviator, confronted with something that defied both reason and the natural laws he had devoted his life to mastering. Aviation schools and training manuals, Thompson's story began to appear not as a warning about mechanical failure, but as a case study in psychological resilience and situational awareness. Instructors emphasized that pilots could never rely solely on instruments, charts, or prior experience. The mind itself could be deceived, particularly when faced with isolation, unusual environmental conditions, or phenomena beyond ordinary explanation. Harold's flight was presented as a cautionary tale. No matter how skilled or disciplined a pilot, the skies, and particularly certain regions of the Cascades, held uncertainties that could overwhelm even the most rational mind. Locally, Harold's encounter evolved into a form of legend. Longtime residents, particularly loggers, hikers, and pilots who frequented the area, treated the mountains with a mixture of reverence and fear. They spoke of the haunted sky corridor, not merely as a cautionary nickname, but as a place where the rules of the ordinary world seemed suspended. Stories continued to circulate of voices echoing in the mist, shadows darting among trees, and inexplicable sensations of being watched. For those who had grown up with Harold's story, the mountains were no longer just a natural landscape. They were a living, breathing entity capable of producing phenomena that could defy explanation and leave witnesses questioning their own senses. Harold's personal legacy, however, was more intimate and profound. After the incident, he never approached the Cascade Ridges alone again. Colleagues noted subtle changes in his demeanor, moments of introspection, long pauses when recounting the flight, and a persistent unease in the presence of fog or dense forest. Friends reported that he would sometimes mutter to himself, describing the forest as if it were sentient, as though it were aware of every movement and could manipulate perception at will. Though he continued to fly for many years, the memory of his own voice echoing from the unseen depths of the mountains remained a specter, influencing every flight plan and shaping his understanding of the world in ways that were both personal and profound. The story also sparked broader cultural interest. Writers, journalists, and folklorists began documenting the phenomena associated with the Cascade Mountains, often citing Harold's flight as a seminal example. It became a bridge between rational investigation and folklore, a narrative that could be studied, debated, and speculated upon without ever reaching a definitive conclusion. In this sense, Harold's experience transcended its immediate circumstances, offering insight into how communities interpret events that challenge conventional understanding, and how legend can form around a single inexplicable incident. Psychologically, the flight underscores the fragile nature of human perception in extreme or ambiguous circumstances. Even highly trained individuals like Harold could experience phenomena that defy explanation, highlighting how isolation, stress, and unfamiliar sensory input can converge to create experiences that feel undeniably real, yet resist rational analysis. Scholars and aviation psychologists have cited his case when exploring the limits of cognition under stress, the impact of environmental anomalies on perception, and the ways in which memory and fear can reinforce experiences that are otherwise inexplicable. Over time, the mountains themselves became inseparable from the story. Tourists, hikers, and aviators alike approached the Cascade Ridges with a heightened awareness, carrying Harold's cautionary experience in mind. Maps and guidebooks often referenced areas associated with unusual phenomena, and local museums preserved accounts of the incident alongside photographs, newspaper clippings, and journals that documented the search parties and investigation. The narrative transformed the terrain from mere wilderness into a space of enduring mystery, a living archive of human curiosity, fear, and fascination. Ultimately, Harold Thompson's flight has become a symbol of the intersection between human skill and the unknown. It reminds pilots, explorers, and historians alike that even the most measured, experienced individuals are vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension. The story resonates because it is not merely about a mysterious voice or a lost plane. It is about the fragile boundary between reality and the inexplicable, a boundary that Harold crossed in a moment that continues to haunt the Cascade Mountains and the minds of those who hear his tale. As the fog rolls back over the Cascade Ridges and Harold Thompson's voice fades into the shadows of history, one question lingers. What if the boundaries of reality are not as solid as we believe? Could the mountains, the forests, and the skies themselves be holding secrets that reach beyond explanation, echoing the fears and voices of those who came before us? Tonight you've glimpsed a story that teeters between truth and legend, a tale that refuses to let go. If the memory of Harold's flight chills you, if the thought of hearing your own voice calling from the void unsettles you, then you're part of this exploration of the unknown. Subscribe now to journey deeper into the mysteries that history tried and failed to bury. Share your thoughts below. Do you believe Harold experienced something supernatural? Or was it a quirk of the mind in the mountains' oppressive solitude? Your reflections might be the spark that uncovers the next haunting story. Every episode is another doorway into the shadows of our past, where truth and terror collide. Don't miss the next whisper from history. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and keep listening because some mysteries are never meant to be forgotten.